the implementation of leverage leasing and using the investment tax credit when it came about was that basically government's way of stimulating the economy back then? Let's say the then past version of quantitative easing that we
Sure.
talk about today.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see going forward is a rerun of the sort of the 70s and 80s. I'm not sure what form it's going to take, but as all these 787s get ready to deliver, and with the leasing laws and the not so much the leasing laws, the accounting laws changing, um, effectively eliminating the leverage lease. If you take just one airline alone, American Airlines has 45 787s on order. I got to believe American Airlines doesn't have the cash to spend on buying 45 787s. So somewhere along the line, someone's going to call Congressman Blowhard up and say, Congressman, we need some help financing these aircraft. And right now, of course, the airline industry is as welcome on the Hill as leverage lessors are because, the Hill doesn't like flying any more than you and I. And so there's not very much sympathy on the Hill for the airlines. But sooner or later, since they're not only flying the legislators, but they're flying lots and lots of people, somebody's going to have to do something to bring back a tool that will help finance these aircraft. Large capital users, industries that use a lot of capital, are going to need financial tools going forward. And I'm very concerned that the way the accounting is going and the way the rule makers have sort of locked arms is not going to help this industry.
The Curiously, not that you're an economist or I'm an economist either, but the way in which the administration of Congress is going, do you think going the route of history, using history as a lesson, at least in our industry, of encouraging capital formation and investment in capital equipment in the United States, that could have been a go and dust off an old lesson, and they could have went down that road and stimulated the economy that route instead? Would that have, in your mind, been an effective way of doing it versus the way they've done it with the stimulus money that they've put out thus far?
No, I think they're going to get around to doing that. I don't think as an initial step that would have been particularly helpful. This is getting out of the standard leverage leasing business, but I think what would have been better is if they would have somehow pushed TARP and TIFIA together and basically said to the banks, "We're going to give you, 100 to bring your equity, your tier one capital up to the what we believe is the right amount of right level, and then we're going to give you another 100, which we, the government, will stand behind as a contingent liability, and we want that 100 put into infrastructure investments." Because right now you've got tons and tons of equity capital dammed up because they can't get the leverage in these investments. And that's because the banks won't lend. It's not conducive. This is not a good environment for the banks to be investing or lending, because there's not only the risk that the loan will go bad, although in infrastructure investments, I think that's a relatively small risk, but there's also the risk that you're going to argue with the regulator, the Basel regulators, about how much capital you're holding against it, and your balance sheet's going to start moving all over because of these capital discussions. So I do think if they would have done that, it would have gotten more people working, it would have gotten business moving forward, but just to have done the TARP alone doesn't seem to have done anything other than extend the paralysis.
Interesting. Well, I'm all for you to replace Ben Bernanke when his term expires and when he leaves. So I'll be
I
lobbing
wouldn't,
letters for you.
I wouldn't count on that happening.
Well,
Oh,
quite interesting. Let me let me ask a couple other questions. Kind of getting more. We kind of got off track a little bit, but I think that's fine, and it gives a little bit more color to everything here. But what were some of the obstacles to growth that you faced and lessors in general faced in the earlier days, back in the late '70s, earlier '80s, and relative to even like the acceptance of the leasing product back then? It was still not as easily accepted as a useful tool back then as it is today. It's generic form, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right. Back in the early days of the business, I think the lease was considered the tool of choice for credit. And so if you didn't have the ability to go to the bank and borrow, this would be a good way for you to get the equipment that you need, but just do it purely off of cash flow. So that there was a stigma associated with leasing, I think, in those days, that it was more of a suede shoe kind of an operation, a suede shoe kind of an industry.
Suede shoe meaning?
But as more and more capital was required, sorry?
I said suede shoe. Explain that.
Well, in other words, the old blue suede shoe, the shyster, the huckster, the guy who comes in and says, listen, I can structure up something for you here that'll make your eyes water, and you'll get the equipment and everything will be fine. But as time went on and capital was required, more and more capital was required in order to meet the needs of the railroads and the airlines and so forth. The business switched around from being a tool for lesser credits to being a tool for better credits. And as a result of that, of course, the industry grew like wildfire.
Okay. And so I guess to summarize then, early days it was a tool for those who couldn't afford the capital, and today it's moved to more of a tool just for those who can't afford, just like bank loans in general.
Yeah, kind of the same kind of an idea.
Okay.
And then the market, of course, from the lessor's perspective, the market began to bifurcate, in effect, like a parfait. So at the top of the parfait, you would have the guys who were really interested in credits, banks. And then if you went downstream a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit, you ended up with the credit companies, the Westinghouse credits, the CITs, all the industrials that had credit companies that were more willing to take a rumble on the asset if they had to go out and repossess it. So they went just a little bit down market. And then, of course, when you went all the way down to what was the old blue suede shoe candidates, the lesser credits, those became the realm of smaller independents, because they really did make a business of working the equipment. They basically made the investment with the idea that within years they were going to have to take the equipment back anyhow.
But in all times, it seemed to me, maybe with the exception of that top tier, that parfait, it was an asset play. It was the equipment play, concern about the equipment, evaluation of the value of that equipment over a period of time, and its secondary and third uses, correct?
That's correct. I guess what I would say, or the color I would add to that, is that from a bank's perspective, it was never about the equipment, because the last thing the bank ever wanted to do was have that thing sitting on the front lawn. So what the bank looked at it for is the potential upside on the residual at the end of the lease. And of course, over time, that potential upside, it started out back when where the banks got all the upside and the less got nothing. Then the brokerage community introduced the concept of the purchase option. And that purchase option came in many flavors. It came in an early buyout option. It came in a fair market purchase option. And so what the community, the brokerage community said is, listen, Mr. Lessee, you know the value of this equipment. So when do you think it's going to be worth the most along this 20-year time period? And the lessee would say, well, I think it'll be worth the most in about 12 years. Okay, we'll go back to the lessor community and require an early buyout option at year 12. And so it became, at that point in time, a bet. Who knows the industry better than each other?
The industry or the equipment?
Yeah, so if the industry was hot in 12 years, the lessee would exercise the purchase option and flip the equipment and sell it and take the profits himself.
Right.
If it wasn't, then the lessor would continue. He waived the early buyout, and the lessor would continue until the lease termination. And invariably, there was negotiated over time fixed purchase option at the end or a fair market purchase option at the end. And so this was an evolution over time that shifted the economic benefits from being primarily with the lessor to being primarily with the lessee. So that at the end, when leverage leasing sort of collapsed with the LILOs and the silos, basically what was happening is the lessor was getting all the downside risk and the lessee was getting all the upside potential, which drove banks away from this business.
And then give me a time frame. When was that started to move away?
Well, I would say probably the if you went back as an archaeological dig, you would start somewhere in the early 90s. Actually, the POs and all that stuff started coming up in the mid 80s. But the evolution of this thing took place from the late 80s through the 90s and probably reached its culmination a little after the turn of the century.